The morning fog had not yet lifted from the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace when Guard Captain Edmund Ashworth arrived for his shift. He actually was 43 years old, built like a wardrobe someone had taught to stand at attention, and he had served the crown for 21 years without a single mark against his record. He polished his boots the same way every morning, left first, then right, 7 circular strokes each, and he believed, with a quiet and total certainty, that order was the highest form of love a man could offer the world. He had never once been late. He had never once spoken out of turn. He had memorized the royal household protocols the way other men memorized scripture, not because someone told him to, but because he found them sacred. Which is exactly why what happened on that Tuesday in March would unravel the next 6 weeks of his life in ways he had not remotely prepared for. It started small, the way all large things do. A memo appeared on the board inside the guardhouse. Standard paper, standard font, 3 short paragraphs that Edmund read standing up because he had not yet taken off his coat. The memo informed all Royal Guard personnel that, following the official announcement from the palace and, in accordance with the updated royal style and titles framework, they were now required to formally acknowledge and address the consort using the title Her Majesty the Queen. Edmund read it once. Then, again. Then, a third time, moving his lips very slightly the way he only ever did when something had genuinely unsettled him. He pinned the memo back to the board with the same pin he had removed. He straightened it so the corners were perfectly aligned with the board's edge. Then, he walked to the small window at the end of the guardhouse. Stood there looking at the fog over the gates without saying a single word for approximately 4 minutes. His colleague, a younger guard named Petrie who had only been with the royal household for 3 years and still got nervous on state occasion days, watched this from across the room and chose, wisely, not to speak. It wasn't that Edmund had anything personal against the woman. He wanted to be very clear about that, at least to himself, in the privacy of his own mind. It wasn't personal. He had nothing personal against anyone. What Edmund had was a very old and very carefully maintained internal filing system. In that system, certain things belonged in certain categories, and those categories didn't rearrange themselves simply because a memo appeared on a board. In his system, Queen was a word that meant something specific. Well, it had a history. It had a weight. It had, most importantly, a long and serious process involving bloodlines, legal frameworks, public ceremonies, constitutional documents, and decades of expectation. You didn't simply arrive at Queen, you were born toward it, or you married into the direct line of it, or the full constitutional machinery of the country moved on your behalf. Those were the routes. Plus, those had always been the routes. The memo on the board didn't change that machinery. The memo was just a piece of paper. Edmund went honestly to his post. He stood at the east gate that morning as he did every morning, shoulders back, chin parallel to the ground, eyes fixed at the mid-distance point he had identified years ago as the exact right place to look so that you appeared alert without appearing aggressive. Tourists photographed him. He didn't blink. A small child in a yellow rain jacket pressed her face against the iron bars and made a noise at him. He didn't react. 3 diplomatic vehicles passed through. He acknowledged them by the book, title by title, exactly as protocol required. Then, the black car came. He recognized it before he saw the plates. He had memorized the car, the driver, the usual timing of the route. He knew who was inside before the window came down and the aide leaned out and said the words Edmund had been waiting to respond to all morning. Her to be fair, Majesty the Queen. Edmund's response was immediate, correct in every logistical sense, and completely wrong in the one sense that would matter. He opened the gate. He stood aside, and he gave the formal acknowledgement of passage. But he used the old title. The previous title. The one from before the memo. He said it quietly, almost under his breath, in the way that a man says something he knows is going to cause trouble but says it anyway because he can't locate the part of himself that would say anything different. The aide heard it. Honestly, the aide said nothing. The car moved through. Edmund watched it go and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and not quite dread. It was the feeling of a man who has made a decision and doesn't yet know the full weight of what he's decided. Petrie, standing 6 feet away, had heard it too. He looked at the middle distance very carefully and said nothing, which was the smartest thing Petrie had done in 3 years of service. Word moved the way word always moves inside institutions, not all at once, but in a slow tide. By afternoon, 2 senior officers had been made aware that Guard Captain Edmund Ashworth had, on the record, used the incorrect form of address at the East Gate. By the following morning, the matter had been flagged for a formal review. By Wednesday, for what it's worth, Edmund had been called to a meeting that was described, in the scheduling note, as a conversation regarding protocol alignment, which was the household's way of saying something serious while making it sound like a diary entry about office furniture. Edmund wore, for what it's worth, his best uniform to the meeting. He wore it pretty much, because he respected the process, even when the process was coming for him. He sat across from Deputy Household Comptroller Margaret Rowe, who had served the royal household for 31 years and had the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they've outlasted 4 different administrations and 2 constitutional crises. She looked at him for a long moment before she said anything. Then, she said, "Captain Ashworth, tell me what happened at the East Gate on Tuesday." Edmund told her. Honestly, he was precise. He didn't embellish, didn't apologize, didn't use any word that wasn't necessary. He explained what he had said, why he had said it, and the internal reasoning that had led him there. He cited specific clauses in the Royal Household Protocol Manual, the 1953 edition, the 1972 revision, and the 2005 updated guidelines. He had not looked these up before the meeting. He had them memorized. Plus, Margaret Rowe listened to all of it without expression. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You are aware," she said, "that the updated guidelines supersede the previous editions." "Funny enough, yes," Edmund said. "And you are aware that the announcement was official, formal, and publicly recorded." "Just my take." "Yes," Edmund said. And yet, Edmund agreed. She looked at him again in that particular way of hers, the one that felt like being examined through very precise scientific equipment. Then, she said something that Edmund had not expected, and which would stay with him for a long time afterward. "Captain Ashworth," she said, "I'm going to ask you something I don't normally ask in these meetings. I want you to think about it before you answer. Not what protocol says, not what the manual says. What do you actually believe the problem is?" Funny enough, Edmund looked at the far wall. The question sat in the room between them like an object that had been set down very carefully and would break if he moved it wrong. He said, "I believe the title should mean something." Margaret Rowe said nothing. "I've served under this household for 21 years, Edmund continued, and his voice was still level, still precise, but something in it had shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a floorboard shifts under weight without making a sound. I have stood at that gate in every kind of weather, for every kind of occasion, and I have said every title correctly every single time, because those titles were correct. They were correct because they were earned, and because they had a path. Because they weren't assigned. They were arrived at." He stopped. He straightened his already straight jacket. "I'm not disputing the announcement," he said. "I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying that I don't know, in my own mind, how to say the words as though they mean what they used to mean. And I can't say them that way yet, you know?" That last word, "yet," was the only concession Edmund Ashworth was capable of making on that particular Tuesday in March, and both he and Margaret Rowe understood exactly how much it cost him. She sent him back to his post. Plus, she told him the matter was under formal review and that he was to use the correct form of address going forward, and that she expected full compliance with the updated protocol, and that this conversation would be noted on his file. Edmund said yes. He, meant it, or at least he intended to mean it, which is a different thing that sometimes masquerades as the same. He went, back to the East Gate. He, I think, stood in his place. Plus, honestly, the fog had burned off by now and the afternoon had gone cold and bright, the particular kind of London bright that's beautiful in a way that looks accidental. He stood well, there thinking about a word he had used in Margaret Rowe's office. Arrived at, he had not planned to use it. It had come out of him the way things come out of people when they're asked to explain something they've previously had to put into language. And now it was in the air and in the record, and there was no taking it back. He actually thought about the word for a long time, standing at his post, watching the gates. The thing was, and Edmund knew this, somewhere beneath the protocol manual and the polished boots. The 21 years of straight-back service, the thing was that he could not entirely account for all of his reasons. He had given Margaret Rowe the ones he understood. The constitutional argument. The honestly weight of tradition, and the process. The path. But there was something else that he had not said and could not quite locate, something that had to do with a kind of grief he didn't have a name for, a mourning for a version of things that had existed and then been rearranged, and the rearrangement felt like a fact being quietly removed from history and replaced with a different fact that wasn't quite the same shape. He wasn't, he told himself, a man who grieved for the past. But he was a man who believed that the present had to earn its right to rename the past. And that was the piece he could not get around. 3 days later, the memo came down from the board. A new memo replaced it, this one more detailed, more explicit, with specific language about compliance expectations and formal procedures. Kind of, Edmund read it. Plus, he replaced it on the board at exactly the same angle as the previous one. He went to his post. And the next time the car came through the east gate, with the 8 in the window saying the words, Edmund Ashworth opened his mouth. What came out wasn't the old title, but it wasn't quite the new one either. It was a pause, a brief, technically inexcusable, 3-second pause before a form of words that was technically compliant and utterly, unmistakably hollow. Petrie heard it and looked at the middle distance again. The 8 heard, to be fair, it and looked at Edmund for just a moment too long before the window went up. Edmund stood at his post in the cold bright afternoon and didn't move and didn't blink and didn't permit himself to feel whatever it was he was feeling, because he was on duty, and on duty was the one place he had always been able to be entirely himself. That was the thing about duty. It had always been enough. It had always been clear. He was beginning, for the first time in 21 years, to understand what it felt like when it wasn't the review board met on a Thursday. Edmund had known it was coming for 9 days. He had gone to his post each of those 9 days in the same way, same time, same route, same 7 circular strokes on each boot, and he had done his duty exactly as required, or close enough to exactly that no individual moment could have been cited on its own as a clear violation. But the accumulated texture of those 9 days had been noticed by people whose job it was to notice texture, and so the board met on a Thursday in the small conference room on the second floor of the administrative wing, the one with the portrait of a former household comptroller whose name Edmund had known since his second week of service and whose expression, in the portrait, was almost exactly the expression Edmund wore at the gate, watchful, composed, committed to something the painter had not quite managed to name. There were 3 people on the review board. Margaret Rowe was one. The other 2 were people Edmund knew by title and by sight but had never spoken to at any length. Senior Protocol Officer Hartley, a compact man in his 50s with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades deciding which rules bent and which rules didn't, and Household Secretary Alderton, who was newer to the role and had the careful posture of someone still proving they deserved to be in the room. Edmund sat across from all 3 of them and didn't need to be told to sit up straight. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. Edmund knew this because he had a habit of noting times the way other people noted landmarks. Not obsessively, just steadily, the way you keep track of where you are in a country you know well. Hartley opened by reading the formal description of the matter, which took 4 minutes and covered the original Eastgate incident, the subsequent meeting with Comptroller Rowe, the compliance record of the 9 days following, and 3 specific occasions on which the form of address used at the gate had been, in the board's words, technically within the letter of the updated guidelines while demonstrably departing from their spirit. Real talk, Edmund didn't disagree with any of it. He had not expected to, what he had not expected was what Hartley said next. Captain Ashworth, Hartley said, setting down the document, I want you to understand that this board's concern isn't primarily disciplinary. We are not here to punish you. We are here because your case has raised a question that, frankly, this household hasn't had to formally address before, and we think you deserve a full accounting of why that question matters. Edmund looked at him. The question, Hartley continued, is this: at what point does a member of the Royal Guard's private conviction about the legitimacy of a title become a professional liability to the Crown, and at what point does it become something else entirely? The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a pigeon landed on the ledge and then left again, as if it had arrived at the wrong meeting. Edmund said, "What would the something else be?" Hartley glanced at Margaret Rowe. She didn't look back at him, which Edmund understood to mean that this had been discussed before he arrived. "A legitimate, in my opinion, expression of a view that other people hold," Hartley said. "I think, privately. A view that, were it to be expressed through official channels rather than through the deliberate inflection of a gate address, might be not agreed with, necessarily, but understood." Edmund processed this. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the way I'm doing it's the problem." "Not that I'm doing it. If that makes sense." "We are telling you," Margaret Rowe said, speaking for the first time, "that there's a difference between a man who refuses to comply and a man who complies in a way that makes his refusal visible to everyone who passes through his gate. The first man is subject to dismissal, which the second man is something the household has to think about more carefully." Edmund sat with that for a moment. He had been in this institution long enough to understand that what was being offered to him right now wasn't a reprimand and not an exoneration. It was something more like an invitation to a conversation the household wasn't sure it wanted to be having but had found itself in anyway, partly because of him and partly because of a change that had moved faster than the institutions built to manage it. "I have complied," Edmund said. "With the letter?" "Yes," Hartley said. "And the letter is what we're required to enforce. Which is why you are not being dismissed today." "But," Edmund said. "But," Hartley agreed. "There's the matter of the spirit, which and the matter of what it communicates to people who pass through that gate every day and hear the pause and understand what it means. Those people basically include staff, which visitors, officials of foreign governments, press, on occasion." Edmund had not thought about the press. He thought about it now, briefly and without pleasure. "What would you like me to do?" he asked. And this was the moment that the review board had, apparently, been preparing for, because all three of them shifted slightly in their chairs in the way people shift when they're arriving at the point they've been building toward. Hartley said, "We would like you to talk to someone." Edmund blinked. It was one of only a handful of times in the meeting that his face had moved. "Someone," he repeated. "A historian," Hartley said. "Plus, Dr. Calloway. She works with the Royal Collection and has spent considerable time with the documented history of royal titles, their evolution, and the precedents or lack thereof for situations like this one. We thought that perhaps what you are working through isn't a question of willingness but of understanding. And if understanding is what's needed, then understanding is what we can provide." Edmund looked at the three of them for a long moment. He was trying to determine if he was being managed or genuinely offered something. He had been in institutions long enough to know those two things could sometimes occupy the same gesture. "All right," he said, which he met Dr. Calloway the following honestly, Tuesday, in a small office near the archive rooms in the East Corridor, a place that smelled of paper in the very specific way. That old paper smells, not musty, not unpleasant, but definitively old, as though the air itself remembered being part of something. She was a small woman in her late 60s with the kind of face that had arrived at its current expression through a long series of very interesting arguments. She wore a cardigan the color of old mustard and had reading glasses pushed up onto her head that she appeared to have forgotten about. She didn't stand when Edmund came in. She looked up from a very large book and said, "Sit down, Captain. I've been reading about your situation." Edmund sat. "What have you concluded?" "Here's the thing, that you're wrong about several things," she said pleasantly, "and right about one, and that the one you're right about is the one that's making this difficult." He waited. She closed the large book, not carefully, with a kind of casual confidence. That suggested she had memorized what she needed from it and leaned back in her chair. "Let's start with what you're wrong about," she said. "You believe, I gather, that the title of Queen has historically followed a single clear path. Bloodline or direct constitutional marriage. That the path has been consistent, which that precedent is clean. isn't it?" Edmund said. "For what it's worth, absolutely not," she said. "It is one of the messiest series of precedents in the entire history of the British monarchy, which is saying something extraordinary because the history of the British monarchy is almost nothing but mess. Would you like some examples?" He said yes, mostly because he was a man who had spent 21 years believing in the clarity of that path, and if the path wasn't clear, he wanted to know. She gave him examples. She gave him a lot of examples. She talked for, I guess, 35 minutes with the speed and precision of someone who has thought about these things so often that the thinking has become a kind of physical pleasure, and Edmund listened in the particular way he only listened when something was genuinely dismantling something he had believed to be load-bearing in his internal architecture. There were consorts throughout history who had received the title through processes that had no constitutional precedent at all. There were cases where the title had been withheld through processes that had every constitutional precedent and were now widely regarded as morally catastrophic. There were cases where the question of legitimacy had been argued publicly for decades and then quietly dropped when everyone who had argued it loudest had died. There were, in short, almost no clean examples. The title, Dr. Calloway said, at the end of her 35 minutes, has never meant just one thing. It has always been contested. It has always been political, and it has always been a negotiation between what the law says, what tradition says, what the public accepts, and what the institution needs at a particular moment. I mean, defending isn't a pristine, unambiguous standard. You're defending the most recent version of a standard that has been renegotiated dozens of times over 600 years. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "And the thing I'm right about," he said. Dr. Calloway looked at him over the rims of her forgotten glasses. "That titles mean something," she said. "That they're not decorative. Plus, that when an institution uses words, those words carry history and weight and consequence, and using them carelessly degrades not just the words but the institution. You're not wrong about that, you're just wrong about which version of careful is being careless." That was the sentence that stayed with Edmund Ashworth for the rest of the week. He went back to his post. He thought about the sentence the way he thought about protocol, not obsessively, but consistently, returning to it each time it appeared at the edge of his thinking. He also started, very quietly and, without telling anyone, to read. He went to the archive rooms in the evenings, with special temporary access arranged by Dr. Calloway without ceremony or comment. He sat at the long table under the fluorescent lights and read through documents he had never had reason to look at before, records of previous title adjustments, correspondence between the palace and parliamentary advisors, legal opinions drafted in the 1950s and the 1970s and the early 2000s about exactly the kinds of questions Edmund had been trying to answer at his gate by using the wrong word. What he found, reading through those documents in the evenings, wasn't what he expected. He didn't find clean precedent. He didn't find a simple story. He found a long and very complicated argument that had been running, in one form or another, for centuries about what the monarchy was for, what its symbols meant, how much of its power came from law and how much from the belief of the people who looked at it, and whether those two sources of power could ever be neatly separated. He found, in a letter from 1953 that he sat with for a very long time, a senior official writing to a colleague about exactly the kind of situation Edmund was now in. Not the same situation, but the same shape of situation, a moment when an institution had moved and some of its members had not moved with it at the same speed. The official wrote, "The danger isn't in those who refuse. The danger, honestly, is in an institution that can't account for its own refusals." Edmund read that sentence twice. Then, he went home. He didn't sleep well that week, which was unusual for him. Edmund Ashworth was a man who had always slept well because he had always known where he stood. The difficulty of the current week was that he was beginning to understand that where he stood wasn't where he had believed, I guess, he was standing, and the recalibration required was more significant than he had initially accounted for. On Friday evening, he called his sister, Dorothea, who lived in Edinburgh and had strong opinions about most things and was one of the 3 people in Edmund's life who he trusted to tell him when he was wrong without making him feel like the wrongness was permanent. He explained the situation. Plus, she listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Dorothea and meant she was taking it seriously. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she basically said, "Eddie, can I ask you something?" He said yes. If this had been a different person, she said. Same announcement, same memo, same gate. Plus, different person kind of, in the car. Would you've paused? Edmund didn't answer immediately. He stood in his kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear and the window over the sink showing him the dark street outside and the single lit window in the building opposite. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's the most honest thing you've said about this," Dorothea said, not unkindly. "Figure out what that means." He stood in the kitchen for a while after they hung up, not moving, looking at the lit window across the street. The person in that window, he could see a silhouette, was doing something ordinary. Moving around. Living in evening. Completely unaware that a man across the street was standing in his kitchen trying to locate the exact boundary between principle and prejudice, between a genuine constitutional objection and something older and less defensible that he had dressed up in constitutional language because he was a man who believed in order and had not wanted to look at the other thing directly. He stood there for a long time. Then, he went to bed. And, for the first time since the memo had appeared on the board, he slept. 6 weeks after the memo appeared on the board, Edmund Ashworth was called in for what would be the final formal meeting regarding the matter. He knew it was the final one not because anyone had told him so, but because of the particular quality of the scheduling note. No carefully softened language this time, no protocol alignment, just a time and a room number and the names of the people who would be present. He wore his best uniform again. The room was the same conference room on the second floor. The portrait, of the old comptroller was still there, still wearing its watchful expression. For what it's worth, Margaret Rowe was there. Hartley was there, Witch Alderton was there. And there was a fourth person Edmund had not expected, a woman introduced as Liaison Mercer, from a department that was described only as Institutional Affairs, which in Edmund's experience was the kind of title given to departments whose actual function was considered too sensitive to name accurately. Honestly, Edmund sat down. He didn't fidget. He placed his hands on the table, one on top of the other, and he looked at the four people across from him with the complete steadiness he had developed over 2 decades of standing at a gate in all weather. To be fair, Hartley opened. "Captain Ashworth. In the 6 weeks since this matter was formally flagged, you've attended 3 sessions with Dr. Calloway, completed an independent review of archival materials in the East Corridor collection, and maintained unbroken service at your post. During this period, no further formal incidents have been recorded." He paused. "We've also received, informally, a report from Dr. Calloway regarding her conversations with you. She doesn't share specifics, she wouldn't, but she's indicated that she believes those conversations were, in her words, worthwhile." Real talk, Edmund said nothing. Actually, he waited. The actually question before this board today, Hartley continued, is straightforward in form if not in substance. "Captain Ashworth, can you tell us plainly, without qualification, without the language of protocol manual citations, what you understand now?" "That you didn't understand 6 weeks ago?" It was the same shape of question Margaret Rowe had asked him at the very beginning, and Edmund recognized it as such. The question that had started this had been, "What do you believe the problem is?" The question now was, "What have you learned?" He had prepared for this meeting in his own way, which was to say he had not written anything down, had not rehearsed any particular words, but had thought carefully, in the mornings while polishing his boots, about what was true and what wasn't. He said, "I understand that I wasn't defending what I believed I was defending." No one at the table moved. "I told this board, and Deputy Comptroller Rowe, that my objection was constitutional. That I'd concerns about process, about the established path for a title, about the weight of tradition. I believed those concerns were real, which I still believe parts of them are real. But I spent 6 weeks reading the actual record of how these things have worked, and the record doesn't support the story I told myself." He stopped for a moment. Not because, for what it's worth, he was uncertain of the words, but because he was a man who took precision seriously and he wanted the next part to be precise. "The record shows," he said, "that titles have always been contested, always been political, always been adjusted according to circumstances. There's no pristine path. There has never been a pristine path. I was treating something as a principle when it was actually a preference, and I was dressing the preference in the language of principle because that felt more defensible. Liaison Mercer, who had not spoken yet, looked at him steadily. She was a compact woman in her 40s with the particular quality of someone who had listened to a great many people explain themselves over the years and had developed an excellent internal instrument for distinguishing truth from performance. Edmund had the sense she was running him through that instrument now. He looked actually back at her without apology, which he had nothing to apologize for in his posture. He had only just arrived at this understanding and he was presenting it as accurately as he could, which was all he had ever known how to do. And, the preference, Hartley said carefully. Can you tell us what it was? This was the question Edmund had known was coming. He had sat with it for 2 weeks, since the night in his kitchen looking at the lit window across the street. He had not found a comfortable way to say it. He had found only the accurate way. The preference, Edmund pretty much said, was for a particular version of how things should have been. I'd a strong feeling that the story of the institution I served ought to go a certain way. Not in my opinion, for reasons I could fully defend. Partly because of how I was trained, partly because of what I'd absorbed over 20 years about what the words meant and who earned them and how. And, partly, and this is the part I'd to look at for a long time before I could admit it, partly because of a judgment I was making about a person. That wasn't entirely separate from judgments that other people have made, very loudly, very publicly, for a very long time, and that I'd absorbed without fully accounting for their absorption. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the same pigeons that were always on the ledge were on the ledge. I'm not saying, Edmund continued, that every objection anyone has raised about this situation is reducible to that. I'm saying that mine wasn't entirely free of it, and I didn't know that about myself until I was required to look at it directly, which I was required to do because I used the wrong word at the East Gate and could not explain myself in a way that entirely satisfied me. Margaret Rowe, who had been watching him since he sat down with her particular quality of precise attention, said, "That's an unusually honest accounting, Captain Ashworth." Edmund said, "I'm not in the habit of any other kind." Hartley looked at his and Tez. Then, he set the notes aside, which Edmund recognized as a gesture of finality. The board's position, Hartley said, is this. You haven't been actually dismissed, and you won't be dismissed, because no single action of yours crossed the line of formal insubordination clearly enough to require it. More importantly, what you've done over the past 6 weeks is what we'd want any member of this household to do when they encounter a conflict between their private convictions and their professional obligations. You examined it. Seriously. Without being told how the examination should end. He paused. We are not asking you to agree with every decision this institution makes. We're asking you to understand that your role isn't to adjudicate those decisions at the gate. That's not what the gate is for. Edmund understood. He had always, he realized, understood that. The difficulty had been that for 6 weeks he had not been able to locate the part of himself that was willing to put that understanding into practice, because the part of himself that was willing had been blocked by the part that wasn't yet ready to let go of something it had not yet admitted it was holding. He said, I understand. And, he meant it. Not in the way he had meant it 6 weeks ago when he said yes to Margaret Rowe and, then, went and did the pause. He meant it the way a man means something when he's passed through the thing and come out on the other side with a clearer picture of what the thing actually was. Liaison Mercer spoke for the first time. Captain Ashworth, she said, can I ask you one more thing? Not for the record. Just for my own understanding. Not gonna lie, he looked at her. Yes. If honestly, the car came through the gate today, she said. Right now. The aide in the window, the same words. What would happen? Edmund thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took him to be sure. I'd say it correctly, he said. And, I'd mean it. Or I'd mean it as much as a man can mean something he's just arrived at, which isn't the same as meaning it the way you mean something you've always believed, but is the beginning of it. Liaison Mercer nodded once. She wrote something in her notebook and, then, closed it. The basically, meeting ended, which Edmund thanked the board. He walked out of the conference room and down the corridor with its portraits and its particular smell of old stone and floor polish, and he went down the staircase and back through the building to the courtyard where the light was doing the thing it did in late spring, coming sideways and very bright, making everything cast a shadow that was slightly longer than you expected. He stood in the courtyard for a moment. Not gathering himself, he was already gathered. Just standing, the way you stand in a place you know well when something about it looks slightly different than it did before, not because the place has changed but because you've, and your changed eyes are recalibrating everything they look at. Then, he went to the gate. Petrie was there, finishing the end of his shift. He looked at Edmund with the expression he had been wearing for 6 weeks, careful, neutral, a masterpiece of saying nothing while visibly thinking several things. Edmund took his position. Petrie moved off without a word. The first hour actually was routine. Vehicles in and out. Delivery schedules. A diplomat's car that Edmund acknowledged in perfect protocol French, which he had memorized in 2014 and had never been asked to use since. Then, in the early afternoon, the black car came. Edmund saw it before he saw the plates. He felt his own breathing, which he almost never felt, because his breathing was something he had trained into the background so long ago that it only returned to his awareness when something was about to happen. The window came down. The aide leaned out, and Her Majesty the Queen. Edmund opened the gate. He gave the formal acknowledgement of passage. He used the title. Not the old one. Well, plus, the current one. The one from the memo, which he said it clearly, without inflection that subtracted from it, without a pause that added meaning it wasn't meant to carry. He said it the way he said every title, like it meant something. Because that was the thing he had learned, or rather the thing he had remembered after the learning had stripped away everything he'd built on top of it, the reason he had cared, at the beginning, about the title meaning something, that reason wasn't wrong. The application of it had been wrong. The instinct underneath was the same instinct that had made him good at his job for 21 years, the instinct that said words are not decoration, that an institution's language is its structure, that how you say a thing is part of what the thing is. He had just been aiming it badly. And now he was aiming it the right way. The car moved through. Plus, the aide didn't look at him too long. There was no pause to read, no tone to decode. Just a gate, and an acknowledgement. A title said the way it was meant to be said. The car turned out of the drive and was gone. Edmund stood at his post in the late spring afternoon and felt the thing he had not been able to feel for 6 weeks, the clean and uncomplicated sensation of having done his job correctly. Not technically correctly. Pretty much, plus, correctly. The whole thing, letter and spirit together, the way they were supposed to go together. It wasn't a large feeling. It wasn't a, to be fair, dramatic one. It was the kind of satisfaction that comes from something being put back in its right place after a long time of sitting wrong, and it didn't announce itself with any ceremony because it wasn't that kind of thing. It was just right, which he stood at the gate for 3 more hours. He said all the titles correctly. He didn't think about the memo or the review board or the archive rooms or the lit window across the street or his sister in Edinburgh or any of the 6 weeks he had just moved through. He thought about his post. He thought about the gate. He thought about doing his job, which was the thing he had always been best at, and which he had briefly, at some cost to both himself and the institution he loved, confused with something else. That was the thing about duty, he understood now. It wasn't a wall you stood behind. It wasn't a fixed point you defended from every direction. It was a practice. It was something you did again every day, with all the understanding you had accumulated since the last time, which meant it was always slightly different from what it had been, and the difference wasn't a failure. The difference was the point. He polished his boots that evening, left first, then right, 7 circular strokes, and they came up right, and he set them by the door for morning. Outside, London did what London does in late spring, kept going, without comment or ceremony, making room in its usual unhurried way for everything that had just changed.